Montana, August 1878. The mountain burned as Clementine woke inside an abandoned mine, her wrists bound behind her. The ranch will be ashes by morning, one captor laughed. Gritting her teeth, she forced her thumb free and whispered, "I'm not dying here." Barefoot and bleeding, she ran into the firelit canyon. But were the approaching riders her rescuers or Thaddeus's killers? Let's begin and subscribe to witness Clementine's fight for freedom. The train's brakes screamed against the rails, and Clementine gripped her suitcase handle until her knuckles went white. Montana, she'd pictured green hills and clean air. What she got was a wall of heat that hit her the second she stepped onto the platform, thick and dry, like standing too close to an oven. Dust hung in the air. It didn't seem to want to settle. She was the last one off the train. The conductor didn't even look back at her. Around her, the station buzzed with noise. Men hauling crates, a dog barking somewhere behind the depot, a group of miners leaning against the fence, watching her with the kind of attention that made her stomach turn. One of them whistled, another laughed, and said something to his friend she didn't quite catch, and didn't want to. She'd read the letter so many times the creases were starting to tear. A rancher named Silas Cobb, looking for a wife, good land, steady income. That was the promise. One man, a house, a chance to start over after 3 years of losing pieces of herself in a garment factory that smelled like machine oil and blood from pricked fingers. But the man walking toward her now wasn't one man. He was 3. The first was tall, built like something carved out of granite. A scar ran down through his eyebrow and across his cheekbone, pale against sun-browned skin. He walked like he was used to being watched and didn't care. The second had gentler eyes. A doctor's hands, maybe. The kind that looked like they'd know how to hold something fragile without breaking it. The third stayed a step behind the other two, watching the crowd more than he watched her, his dark hair loose around his shoulders, moving like the ground under his boots belonged to him. Clementine's mouth went dry. Her mind went straight to the worst place it could go. She'd heard the stories on the train. Whispers passed between women in the last car, about brides who arrived and found out the contract wasn't a contract at all, that some men bought girls the way they bought cattle, and once you signed your name, there was no going back. She took a step backward. Her heel caught the edge of a loose board, and she nearly went down. The tall one with the scar reached out, not to grab her, just close enough that she could catch herself on his arm if she needed to. She didn't take it. She straightened on her own, chin up, even as her knees shook. "You're Clementine." It wasn't really a question. "I was told I was marrying one man." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Silas Cobb." "There's no Silas Cobb," the doctor-looking one said gently. "There's us. Gideon, Ezra, and Roan." He nodded at each in turn. "We're sorry for the mix-up. It happens more than it should out here." Mix-up. She almost laughed. Except nothing about this felt funny. "So what am I?" "Some kind of prize the 3 of you are going to split." Something shifted in the scarred man's face. Not anger. Something closer to shame. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Clementine recognized it immediately. The marriage contract. The one with her signature already on it from 3 weeks ago, back when she thought it meant a house and a husband, and nothing more complicated than that. He tore it in half, then in half again. He let the pieces fall, and the hot wind carried them off across the platform, scattering them past the miners' boots. "You ain't cattle," he said. His voice was rough, like it didn't get used for talking much. "Nobody bought you." "Not really. I paid off a debt, so a trafficking ring couldn't get their hands on you first. That's all that money ever meant. You don't owe us a wedding. You don't owe us anything." Clementine stared at the torn paper, scattered in the dirt. For a second, she couldn't breathe right. "Then what do I owe you?" "Nothing," the one called Ezra said. "You're free to walk to that ticket window right now and buy passage anywhere you want. We won't stop you." She looked past them, past the depot, past the dry hills rising golden brown in the distance, all the way out to where the land just kept going, further than she'd ever seen it go back east. There was nowhere for her out there. No family left. No job waiting. Just a train ticket she couldn't afford, and a city that had already used her up once. I don't have anywhere else to go, she admitted, and hated how small her voice sounded saying it. The third man. Roan spoke for the first time. Then come up the mountain, just till you figure your next step. Nobody's going to touch you. Nobody's going to make you do anything you don't choose. She studied his face for a long moment, looking for the lie in it. She didn't find one. Not yet, anyway. But she'd learned the hard way that trust was something you handed out in small pieces, not all at once. Fine, she said. Temporary. Gideon nodded once. Like that, settled it. He reached for her suitcase, and she pulled it back before he could take it. I can carry my own bag. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Suit yourself. They walked her past the miners, who'd gone quiet now, watching the four of them head toward the wagon at the edge of the lot. Clementine kept her spine straight the whole way, even though her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She climbed up into the wagon bed without help, settling her suitcase in her lap like a shield. As the wagon pulled out of town, the heat pressed down harder, the road stretching out ahead of them in waves of shimmering air. Nobody spoke much. Gideon drove. Ezra sat up front beside him. Roan rode alongside on his horse, scanning the tree line out of habit. More than worry. Clementine watched the town shrink behind her. The depot, the torn scraps of her old contract, already buried somewhere in the dust. She didn't know these men. She didn't know this land. She didn't know what waited for her at the top of that mountain. But for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, the fear sitting in her chest had loosened, just a little. Nobody had grabbed her wrist. Nobody had told her what she was for. She still had her own two hands, her own choices, whatever few of them were left to make out here. That would have to be enough. For now, the ranch sat higher up the mountain than Clementine expected, tucked into a clearing surrounded by pine and rock, with a view that stretched out over the valley for miles. Under different circumstances, she might have called it beautiful. Right now, all she could think about was how far away it was from anything familiar. The drought had been going on for weeks, they told her. The creek behind the house had shrunk down to a trickle. The grass in the pasture had gone the color of straw. Even the air smelled dry, like dust and pine sap and heat that never quite let up, not even after the sun went down. She didn't unpack much that first night, just enough to get by. She lay awake in the small room they'd given her, listening to the house settle around her, to boots on the porch, low voices she couldn't make out through the wall. She kept waiting for the door to open. It never did. By morning, she'd made up her mind about a few things. She wasn't going to be a burden. She wasn't going to sit around, waiting for someone to decide what to do with her, either. She'd spent 3 years in a factory taking orders from men who didn't know her name, and she wasn't about to spend whatever came next the same way. She found Gideon on the porch before sunrise, sharpening a hunting knife with slow, even strokes. He didn't look up when she came out. "Where's the washroom?" she asked. He nodded toward the side of the house. "Water's low. Drought's got the well running thin. Then I'll use what's there and be careful with it." That earned her a glance, quick and unreadable, before he went back to his knife. Roan was already out chopping wood when she passed the barn, sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the back of his shirt despite the early hour. He caught sight of her and set the axe down. "You don't have to do that," he said, nodding toward the water pail she carried. "I didn't ask if I had to." He studied her for a second, something almost like amusement crossing his face. "Suit yourself, but don't expect any of us to go easy on you just 'cause you're new here. This mountain doesn't care how tough you talk. I'm not asking anyone to go easy." "Good," he said. "Because you won't last a week, you can't handle a little dust and heat." She didn't answer that. She just picked up her pail and kept walking, chin level, back straight, even though her arms ached before she'd made it halfway to the well. That was the shape of her first few days. Small tests, most of them unspoken. Nobody handed her a chore list. Nobody told her what was expected. She figured it out by watching, by listening at doors she wasn't invited through, by noticing what needed doing and doing it before anyone had to ask. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her knees until her hands went raw. She beat the dust out of every rug in the house. She found the root cellar, half collapsed, and spent 2 days hauling out rotted shelving, ignoring the splinters that worked their way into her palms. Ezra found her out there on the second afternoon, sitting on an overturned crate, picking a long sliver of wood out of her thumb with her teeth. "You could ask for help with that," he said. "I've got it." He crouched down anyway and took her hand before she could pull it back, turning it toward the light. His fingers were careful, steadier than she expected from a man who spent his days out in rough country. He worked the splinter free with a small pair of tweezers he'd pulled from his coat pocket, then pressed a clean cloth to the spot. "You a doctor?" she asked. Something passed over his face, quick and gone. Long story. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "You don't have to prove anything out here. Clementine, nobody's keeping score. Feels like somebody is." He didn't argue with that. He just nodded, like he understood more than he was letting on, and left her to finish her work. That night, after supper, after the dishes were done and the men had scattered to their separate corners of the house, Clementine climbed up into the attic, looking for old linens to patch a hole in her blanket. What she found instead was a trunk shoved back under the eaves, its lid warped from years of heat and cold. Inside were books, dozens of them, law texts, thick medical volumes, their spines cracked from use, pages dog-eared and marked up in careful handwriting. She recognized the writing style before she found the name scrawled inside the front cover of one. She sat on the attic floor with a book open across her knees and read until the candle burned low, until her eyes ached, until she heard the house go quiet below her. Property law, contracts, the kind of language that had always felt locked away from women like her. Like it belonged to men in offices she'd never be allowed to enter. She kept reading anyway, night after night. She started with the simplest passages first, the ones she could actually follow, and worked her way up from there. Nobody in that factory, back east, had ever told her she could understand something like this. She'd started to believe them. She was starting to think they'd been wrong during the days, while the men worked the ranch. She found another use for the old horse stall at the far end of the barn. It hadn't held a horse in years, not since the roof started leaking. But the walls were solid enough, and it had room enough for a few benches if she scrubbed it out and patched the gaps. She'd noticed the children in the valley on her walks, mixed-race kids mostly, some part native. Some the children of laborers nobody in town would look twice at. None of them went to the schoolhouse in town. She'd asked about it once, at the general store, and the woman behind the counter had just given her a look and said some folks weren't welcome there. That didn't sit right with Clementine. It hadn't sat right back east either. Watching girls her age get turned away from anything that might have given them a way out. She knew what it was like to be told you didn't get to learn certain things because of who you were. She started small. A slate board she found in the attic, a stack of old primers from the same trunk. She put the word out through a woman she'd met hauling water, and within a week, 4 children showed up at the barn door, hesitant, watching her like she might change her mind and send them away. She didn't. "Sit," she told them, pointing at the benches. "We're starting with letters." Roan found her out there one evening, watching from the barn door with his arms crossed, saying nothing for a long moment. "You're teaching them to read," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "Somebody has to. Town won't like it. Town doesn't have to like it." She kept her eyes on the slate board, chalk in hand. "These children deserve the same chance as anybody else. That's not something up for debate, far as I'm concerned." Roan was quiet for a while. She thought maybe he'd leave without saying anything else, the way he usually did. Instead, he crossed the barn and picked up one of the primers, flipping through the pages slowly. "Nobody ever taught me much of anything," he said. "Not the kind that came out of a book. You want to sit in." He gave her a look like she'd said something absurd. "I'm 28 years old. Letters don't care how old you are." He set the book down without answering, but she noticed he lingered by the door a little longer than he needed to before he finally walked off toward the tree line. the way he always did when he wanted to be alone with his thoughts. The drought kept the days brutal and the nights hardly better. Clementine grew used to the rhythm of it, the well running low, the constant hauling and rationing, the dust that got into everything, no matter how carefully she swept. She grew used to Gideon's silence, the way he watched the horizon like he expected trouble to come riding out of it any minute. She grew used to Ezra's quiet company in the evenings, the two of them bent over different books at the kitchen table, not talking much, just working through the discomfort of new company in their own ways. She grew used to Roan's grumbling, too, the way he complained about the extra mouth to feed, the extra chores, the disruption to a life he'd carved out for himself, away from people who'd never given him much reason to trust them. She noticed he never actually asked her to leave. He just complained loud enough that maybe, if she stayed anyway, it wouldn't look like his idea. One evening, hauling water back from the well, she overheard the three of them on the porch, unaware she was close enough to hear. "She won't last," Roan was saying. "Girls like her with her out here. Give it a week. She'll be begging for a ticket back east." "She hasn't complained once," Ezra said. "Not about the heat, not about the work. That's more than I can say for half the ranch hands we've had through here." "She's stubborn," Gideon said. "Doesn't mean she's suited for this life." Clementine set her water pail down harder than she needed to, letting the sound announce her before she stepped into view. All three men went quiet. "I can hear you," she said, "and for what it's worth. I didn't survive 3 years in a garment factory, just to wither on a mountain, because the well's running a little low." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Ezra, of all people, let out a short laugh, quickly covered by his hand. "Fair enough," he said. Gideon didn't smile. Not exactly. But something in his face eased, just slightly. Roan just shook his head and muttered something under his breath that might have been an apology, if she squinted at it right. She picked her pail back up and carried it inside without another word. But she caught the look Gideon gave her back, steady and considering, like he was starting to see something in her he hadn't expected to find. That night, after the children had gone home and the house had gone quiet, Clementine sat in the attic with Ezra's old law book open on her lap, chalk dust still on her fingers from the day's lesson. She thought about the factory floor she'd left behind, the machines that never stopped, the foreman who'd looked at every girl in that room like she was replaceable. Out here, the heat was worse, the work was harder, but nobody had told her what she couldn't do. Not yet, anyway. She turned the page and kept reading. Word about the schoolhouse in the barn traveled faster than Clementine expected. She should have known it would. A town that small didn't keep secrets long, especially not ones involving children who weren't supposed to exist in the eyes of men like Judge Thaddeus. She'd heard his name mentioned a few times since arriving, always with the same tightness in the voice that said it, like folks were afraid saying it too loud might draw his attention. It drew his attention anyway. The morning it happened, Clementine had 6 children in the barn instead of 4, seated on the benches with their slates propped on their knees, sounding out words from the primer she'd been working through with them. The barn door had been left open for the breeze, what little of it there was in the relentless heat. And that was how she first heard the horses. 3 riders, moving fast, kicking up dust that hung heavy in the still air. She recognized none of them, but she recognized the look on their faces well enough. Men sent to do a job they didn't particularly care about, only cared about getting paid for. "Get inside," she told the children, already moving to block the barn door. "Go on now." They scrambled toward the back of the barn, toward the gap in the boards they used, to slip out unseen when town folks came around asking questions. Clementine stood her ground at the door, arms crossed, chin up, even as her heart hammered hard enough she could feel it in her throat. "This is private property," she said, before any of the 3 riders could dismount. "You've got no business here." The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a badge that looked more decorative than official, swung down off his horse anyway. "Judge Thaddeus don't take kindly to unlicensed schooling, especially not for that kind of children. There's no law against teaching a child to read. There's a law against disturbing the peace. And there's a law against trespassing. Seeing as this barn technically belongs to men with no legal standing to own it, he nodded toward his companions. Tear it down. Clementine planted herself directly in the doorway. You'll have to go through me first. The man studied her for a moment, something ugly working behind his eyes. Like he was deciding whether a woman standing in his way was worth the trouble of moving her by force. He might have decided it was, if the sound of hooves hadn't come thundering up the trail behind him. Roan came in fast, faster than Clementine had ever seen him move, off his horse before it had even fully stopped, putting himself between her and the three riders in one motion. Get back inside, he told her, not looking away from the men in front of him. Roan now. She didn't move far, just enough to keep the children shielded behind her, close enough to see everything that happened next. It happened fast. One of Thaddeus's men went for a length of chain hanging off his saddle, swinging it toward Roan's head. Roan ducked it, came up swinging, and for a moment, it looked like he might actually hold the three of them off on his own, moving like something wild and unpredictable, using the terrain and the barn itself as cover. Then the second man pulled a knife. Clementine watched it happen almost slower than seemed possible, the blade catching the sunlight as it arced toward Roan's side. He twisted, tried to get clear of it, but not fast enough. The knife caught him along the ribs, deep enough that he staggered, deep enough that dark red bloomed fast across his shirt. Roan, she was moving before she'd decided to, forgetting every warning to stay back, putting herself between him and the man with the knife, with nothing but her own bare hands, and the fury rising up in her chest. Maybe it was the sheer unexpectedness of it, a woman charging forward instead of running. But it bought Roan enough time to shove the man back, hard enough to knock him off balance. Then Gideon arrived, and whatever fight had been left in Thaddeus's men drained out fast. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look on his face alone was enough to send all three riders scrambling back onto their horses, one of them shouting something about the judge not being finished with this, before they rode off in a cloud of dust that took a long time to settle. Roan went down to one knee the moment the danger passed. One hand pressed hard against his side, blood seeping between his fingers. Don't, Clementine said, already at his side, pulling his hand away to look at the wound. Don't you dare pass out on me. Wasn't planning on it, he managed, though his voice had gone tight and thin. Ezra came running from the house, medical bag already in hand, like some part of him had known this day would eventually come. Get him inside. Now they carried him to the kitchen table, the same table Clementine had spent so many quiet evenings reading at, and Ezra cleared it in one sweep of his arm, sending a stack of books crashing to the floor. I need clean water, boiled if you can manage it fast, and every clean cloth in this house. Clementine didn't hesitate. She'd spent 3 years following orders in a factory that demanded speed and precision, and whatever fear she felt now, she buried it deep enough to keep her hands steady. The night that followed stretched long and terrible. Roan's wound was deep, deeper than Ezra liked, and the suturing took time, careful, patient work by lamplight, while Roan gritted his teeth against the pain and refused, stubbornly, to let anyone give him more than a swallow of whiskey to dull it. Clementine stayed the whole time. She held the lamp steady when Ezra's hands needed both free. She pressed clean cloths to the wound when he told her to. She didn't flinch, not once, not even when the blood soaked through faster than she could keep up with it. You've done this before, Ezra said at one point, glancing at her over Roan's prone body. Never, she admitted, but fainting won't help him. Roan's eyes had drifted shut somewhere in the middle of it, exhaustion and pain finally winning out over his stubbornness. But they opened again near the end, finding Clementine's face in the lamplight. Thought you'd run, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Most women would have run. I'm not most women. Something shifted in his expression, something she couldn't quite name. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed on her, steady, even as Ezra finished the last of the stitches and began wrapping the wound in clean linen. It was well past midnight before Ezra finally straightened. wiping his hands on a cloth stained pink with blood. He'll live. Wounds clean. No sign the blade hit anything vital. He'll need rest. And he won't like hearing that. I heard that, Roan muttered, eyes still closed. Gideon had stood silent in the doorway through most of it, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching everything with the same barely contained fury he'd carried since riding in. When Ezra finally stepped back, satisfied Roan was out of danger, Gideon crossed the kitchen and looked down at the man on the table like he was memorizing every detail of the wound. Thaddeus did this, he said quietly. We don't know that for certain, Ezra said, though his voice carried little conviction. We know it well enough. Gideon's gaze shifted to Clementine, still standing there, with blood on her hands and her sleeves rolled up, her hair coming loose from its pins. Exhaustion written plain across her face, but no fear in it. Not anymore. You didn't run, he said, echoing Roan's earlier words. I told him already. I'm not most women. Gideon studied her a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he gave a short nod and turned to help Ezra clean up the worst of the mess. Clementine sat with Roan through what remained of the night, keeping watch in case the fever Ezra warned her about took hold. It never did, not badly, though Roan's sleep was restless, broken by low murmurs she couldn't quite make out. Near dawn, his eyes opened again, clearer this time, finding her still sitting there, chin propped on her hand, fighting to stay awake. You should sleep, he said. So should you. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, the first she'd seen from him since she'd arrived. Stubborn, takes one to know one. He reached out, slow, deliberate, and closed his hand around hers where it rested on the table beside him. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The gesture said enough. A kind of gratitude. A kind of understanding that hadn't existed between them 3 days earlier. Outside, the first gray light of dawn crept over the mountains, and somewhere out in the valley, 6 children who'd nearly lost their schoolhouse were waking up to a world that had, in one violent night, shown them exactly what people were willing to risk to protect their right to learn. Roan healed slower than he liked, which meant he complained about it constantly, though Clementine noticed he never once complained about her company while he sat around recovering, propped up in a chair on the porch with strict orders from Ezra not to lift anything heavier than a coffee cup. The drought broke that week, not with rain, but with wind. A dust storm rolled in off the plains on a Thursday afternoon, turning the sky the color of an old bruise, forcing all 4 of them inside well before the worst of it hit. Gideon barred the shutters. Ezra checked twice that every window was sealed tight. Roan, despite his injury, insisted on helping secure the barn animals before the storm fully closed in, earning himself a sharp look from Ezra that he mostly ignored. By the time the storm hit full force, the cabin had gone dark, despite it being barely past noon. The wind screaming outside, loud enough to rattle the shutters in their frames. Dust worked its way through every gap it could find, coating the inside of the windowsills in fine gray powder. They gathered in the main room, the 4 of them, with nothing to do but wait it out. Clementine sat near the fireplace, though no fire burned in the summer heat, working her way through another of Ezra's law books by lamplight. Roan dozed in his chair, worn out from the exertion of the morning. Ezra read across from her, occasionally glancing up to check on his patient. Gideon stood near the window, watching the storm through a gap in the shutters, restless in the way he always seemed restless when trouble was in the air, even trouble as ordinary as weather. It was Gideon who finally broke the long silence, crossing the room to where Clementine sat, a small leather pouch in his hand that she recognized immediately as money. There's enough here for a train ticket, he said, setting the pouch on the table beside her. Enough for a fresh start somewhere the judge can't reach you. Somewhere safer. Clementine looked at the pouch, then up at his face, searching for whatever had prompted this. You're trying to send me away. I'm trying to keep you alive. His voice had gone rough, tighter than usual. You saw what happened to Roan. That was a warning. Thaddeus won't stop there. Next time, it might be worse. I won't have that on my conscience. So the solution is to pack me off on a train and pretend none of this happened. The solution is you being somewhere Thaddeus can't touch you. Ezra had gone quiet, watching the exchange with careful attention. Roan had stirred awake at some point, listening as well, though he said nothing. His expression unreadable. Clementine stood, the law book sliding off her lap onto the chair behind her. She didn't reach for the pouch of money. Instead, she stepped closer to Gideon, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. I've spent my whole life being told what's safest for me by men who never once asked what I actually wanted, she said. The factory owners back east decided it was safest for me to work 16-hour days for wages that barely covered rent. The marriage broker decided it was safest for me to marry a stranger sight unseen. I'm done letting other people decide what's safest for me. Gideon, I get to decide that now. Clementine, I'm not finished. Her hands came up, cupping his scarred face, feeling him go very still under her touch. You tore up that contract on the platform because you wouldn't buy a person. That was the first time in my life a man looked at me and saw something other than property. I'm not walking away from that because you're scared of what might happen. She let her hand trail from his face, reaching to brush lightly against Ezra's wrist where he sat, watching her with something soft and unguarded in his expression. You gave me your books, she said to him. You taught me, without ever once making me feel foolish for not knowing things I should have been taught years ago. That matters more than you know. Her gaze finally settled on Roan, still recovering in his chair, the bandage visible beneath his shirt where the wound continued to heal. You bled protecting children who most of this territory decided didn't matter, she said. I watched you do that. I'm not the kind of woman who walks away from people, willing to bleed for what's right. The room had gone completely silent except for the storm still raging outside. Gideon looked down at her, something raw and conflicted working behind his eyes. Years of guilt and self-denial visibly warring with whatever had been building in him since the moment she'd stepped off that train. I'm not a canary needing a gilded cage, she said quietly, her voice carrying clear, despite the wind howling against the shutters. I don't need protecting from my own choices. I choose to stay. I choose you. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Gideon's hand came up, gently pushing a stray lock of hair back from her face. His touch, far more careful than his rough exterior, suggested he was capable of. You understand what you're choosing, he said. Not quite a question. This isn't some Eastern parlor. This is hard land, and it doesn't get easier, I've noticed. A faint, almost startled laugh escaped him, quickly smoothed over. You're a stubborn woman. Clementine, I've been told. Ezra had risen from his chair, crossing the room to stand near them, his own expression careful. Hopeful in a way he seemed to be trying to hide. For what it's worth, I think this ranch is better with you on it, whatever that means going forward. Roan, still seated, managed a tired but genuine smile. Took you all long enough to say something. I've been watching you three dance around it for days. Clementine felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight since she'd stepped off that train terrified and alone. Outside, the storm continued to rage, dust and wind battering against the cabin walls. But inside, for the first time since she'd arrived on that suffocating summer platform, she felt something steady beneath her feet, not a promise of safety. Life out here didn't offer guarantees like that. Not with a man like Thaddeus still circling, still determined to take what he believed belonged to him. But she'd made her choice with clear eyes and a full understanding of the risk, the way any person deserved the right to do, man or woman, rich or poor. However, the world had once told them different. The storm broke sometime after nightfall, leaving the mountain air washed clean and cooler than it had been in weeks. Clementine stood on the porch afterward, looking out at a sky finally clear of dust. Stars scattered thick and bright overhead. Behind her, she heard the door open, footsteps crossing the porch to stand beside her. She didn't need to look to know. All three of them had come out to join her, whatever came next, whatever Thaddeus still had planned. She wouldn't face it as property passed between hands. Wouldn't face it as a woman with no say in her own fate. She'd chosen this, chosen them, and for the first time in longer than she could remember. That choice felt entirely, completely her own. Drought had gone on too long by the time August rolled around, long enough that the older folks in town started saying things like worst they'd seen in a decade. The pines up on the mountain had turned brittle, needles crackling underfoot, instead of giving way soft, the way they should. Clementine noticed it on her walks to check the schoolhouse. Everything smelled like kindling waiting for a match. She should have paid more attention to that feeling. The troubles started with a knock on the door. Official looking. A man in a stiff collar carrying papers that he handed over to Gideon, without so much as a greeting. Court order, the man said. Properties being seized. Judge's ruling. Gideon read through the papers twice, his jaw working tighter with each line. When he finally looked up, his eyes had gone cold in a way Clementine hadn't seen since the day she'd met him. On what grounds? Felons can't hold deeds in this territory. Neither can unlicensed practitioners or half-bloods. The man said it flat, like he was reading off a grocery list instead of destroying 3 men's lives in a single sentence. Judge Thaddeus found the original filing improper. Land reverts to the county, effective immediately. This ranch has been in operation for 6 years. Wasn't legal 6 years ago either. Just took this long for somebody to look close enough. The man tipped his hat, unbothered. You've got until sundown to clear your livestock. Judge is being generous, considering. He rode off without waiting for a response, leaving the 4 of them standing on the porch with papers that stripped away everything they'd built, all because of a loophole nobody had thought to check for. He's been planning this, Ezra said quietly, once the rider was well out of earshot. Since the schoolhouse. Since Roan got hurt. He's been building a case this whole time. There has to be something we can do, Clementine said. Some appeal. Some. Not by sundown, Gideon said. Not against a judge who wrote the ruling himself. They spent the rest of the afternoon working fast, moving livestock into the far pasture, gathering what few valuables the house held, trying to salvage whatever they could before Thaddeus's men came back to enforce the order. Clementine worked alongside them, hauling what she could carry, refusing every suggestion that she sit this one out. She was in the barn, gathering the last of the school supplies she'd stored there, when she smelled smoke. Not wood smoke from the house. Something bigger. Something wrong. She stepped outside and saw it. A line of fire creeping along the tree line at the edge of the property, moving fast in the dry wind, feeding on brush and pine needles that hadn't seen rain in weeks. It hadn't started on its own. She knew that the second she saw how evenly it stretched, like someone had walked the perimeter with a torch. Fire, she screamed, loud enough to carry over the wind. Fire in the trees. Gideon came running from the house first, then Roan, still moving stiff from his healing wound, but fast despite it. Ezra followed close behind, already shouting orders about the livestock, still penned near the barn. Thaddeus, Gideon said, staring at the flames already climbing higher, spreading faster than any natural fire had a right to. He's burning us out before we can even fight the ruling. There was no time to be angry about it, not with fire moving that fast, not with a whole mountainside of dry timber, ready to go up like paper. Get the horses, Gideon barked. Roan, cattle. Ezra, help me get the water barrels moved. Clementine not leaving, she said, already grabbing a bucket. Tell me what to do. He looked like he wanted to argue. There wasn't time for that either. Fill buckets. Keep the house line wet. Don't go near the tree line. You understand me. That fire moves faster than you can run. She nodded and got to work, hauling water from what little remained in the well, dousing the ground around the house while the men fought to keep the fire from spreading toward the barn. The night sky turned orange, then a furious red, flames climbing 30 feet into the air in places, the roar of it loud enough to drown out shouting from 20 feet away. Clementine lost track of time working the water line, her arms burning with exhaustion, her lungs raw from smoke that kept rolling down off the mountain no matter which way the wind shifted. She could hear Roan somewhere in the smoke, driving panicked cattle away from the flames. His voice hoarse from shouting. She could hear Gideon further off, chopping a fire break through brush that hadn't stood a chance against the drought. She never heard the men come up behind her. There were 3 of them, faces covered with bandanas against the smoke, moving through the chaos like they belonged there. Like this was exactly the cover they'd been counting on. Clementine barely had time to turn before a hand clamped over her mouth and something hard struck the back of her head. The world went sideways, then dark. She woke to the smell of dust and old rope, her wrists bound tight behind her head throbbing with a pain that made it hard to think straight. It took her a long moment to piece together where she was, an old mine shaft, judging by the timber supports overhead and the cool, damp air that felt nothing like the inferno she'd last remembered. Voices drifted from somewhere near the entrance. 2 men, maybe 3, talking low. She caught fragments. Judge wants her held till the fire clears the property proper. Ranch will be ash by morning. No way those 3 come looking tonight. Clementine tested the ropes around her wrists, feeling the familiar rough burn of hemp against skin already scraped raw. She remembered something Roan had told her once, half joking, while showing her how the ranch hands sometimes freed themselves from bad falls or accidents out on the trail. Dislocate the thumb, he'd said. Pull it against the joint. Hard, fast. It'll hurt like hell, but it'll get you loose. She'd laughed at the time, thinking she'd never need advice like that. She wasn't laughing now. She braced herself against the pain she knew was coming and pulled, hard, feeling the joint pop and shift under the pressure. A sound tore out of her that she barely managed to swallow before it carried to the men outside. Her vision went white for a second, the pain sharper than anything she'd felt before. But her hand slipped free of the rope, and that was all that mattered. She worked the rest of the rope loose with shaking fingers, forcing her thumb back into place with a grimace that nearly buckled her knees. Then she was moving, slow and careful at first, checking the shadows for any sign of the men guarding the entrance. They'd gotten lazy, confident the fire would keep anyone from coming to check on her. She slipped past them in the dark, out through a side opening in the shaft that led into the canyon beyond. And once she was clear, she ran. The canyon floor was nothing but sun-baked stone and loose gravel, brutal on bare feet that had already lost their shoes somewhere in the struggle back at the ranch. She didn't stop to think about the blood she left behind with every step. Didn't let herself think about anything except putting distance between herself and that mine shaft. The sky above the mountain still glowed orange from the fire, but it looked farther away now, and she had no idea if that meant the men had won or lost the fight against it. She just kept running, lungs burning, vision starting to blur at the edges from exhaustion and blood loss, and the raw ache of feet that had given out every kind of protection they'd once had. She didn't know how long she ran before her legs finally gave out from under her, dropping her hard onto the canyon stone. She tried to push herself back up. Her arms wouldn't hold her weight. That was when she heard the horses, 3 riders, tearing through the canyon at a dead run. And for one terrible second, she thought Thaddeus had sent more men to finish what the others had started. Then she recognized the shape of the lead rider, the set of his shoulders. The scar, visible even in the dim light of a sky, still lit orange from the fire behind them. Gideon, she managed, her voice barely a whisper. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, closing the distance between them faster than she thought a man his size could move. He caught her just as her vision finally gave out completely, wrapping her in the heavy weight of his duster before she hit the ground. She surfaced slowly, aware first of movement, the rocking sway of a horse beneath her, then of arms holding her steady against chest that smelled like smoke and leather. Easy, Gideon's voice said, low and rough near her ear. You're safe. I've got you. She tried to speak. Her throat felt like sandpaper, raw from smoke and screaming, and hours of running through dry canyon air. She managed only a small, broken sound before he shushed her gently, adjusting his hold to keep her steady against him. Don't try to talk. Just breathe. Somewhere nearby, she heard Roan's voice, tight with worry. How bad are her feet? Bad, Ezra answered. His own voice clipped and focused. The tone she was starting to recognize as his professional calm. The one that meant he was worried, but wouldn't let it show where it might frighten a patient. We need to get that dirt out before infection sets in. And she's dehydrated bad. Fire's still spreading, Roan said. We can't stop here. We don't have much choice. She can't ride like this much longer. Clementine forced her eyes open, blinking against the disorienting mix of firelight and moonlight. The sky above still glowed orange in places, thick with smoke that blotted out most of the stars. She could feel Gideon's heartbeat under her cheek, fast and hard, betraying the calm his voice had tried to project. The cave, Ezra said suddenly. The old hunting shelter, up past the ridge, dry, sheltered from the wind. We can hole up there till the fire burns itself out. Gideon didn't argue. He turned his horse toward the ridge Ezra had mentioned, Roan falling in close behind, and the three of them pushed on through the smoke-choked dark, moving as fast as the terrain and Clementine's condition would allow. The sky broke open just as they reached the cave entrance. It came without warning, a sudden violent crack of thunder overhead, followed almost immediately by rain. The kind of downpour that seemed to arrive all at once instead of building gradually. Within minutes, the dry canyon around them had turned to running water, and the orange glow that had lit the sky for hours began, slowly to dim. Thank God, Roan muttered, tipping his face up toward the rain for a moment, before ducking into the cave entrance behind the others. Fire won't spread through that. Inside, the cave was dry, and deep enough to shelter all three horses along with the four of them. The sound of the storm outside muffled to a steady, distant roar. Gideon carried Clementine further in. Setting her down carefully on a bedroll, Ezra had already spread out, while Roan worked to get a small fire going near the entrance, careful to keep the smoke drafting outward. Let me see your feet, Ezra said, kneeling beside her. She let him take her foot in his hands, wincing as he examined the cuts and blisters, covering nearly every inch of skin. Dirt ground deep into wounds that had bled freely during her run through the canyon. This is going to hurt, he warned her. I need to clean these properly, or infection will set in fast. Do it, she said, voice still hoarse. He worked with the same careful precision he'd shown, stitching Roan's wound weeks earlier, cleaning each cut, checking for embedded gravel, wrapping what he could in strips of clean cloth torn from his own shirt. Clementine bit down hard against the pain, refusing to make more noise than she could help, though tears slipped free more than once despite her best efforts. Gideon stayed close the whole time, one hand resting against her shoulder, steady and grounding, while Roan kept the fire fed and the horses settled, glancing over every few minutes to check her progress. How'd you get free? Gideon asked quietly, once Ezra had finished bandaging her feet. Dislocated my thumb, she admitted. Roan showed me how. Once. Told the story like it was a joke. Roan looked up sharply from the fire. You actually did that. Didn't have much choice. He crossed the cave to kneel beside her, taking her injured hand carefully in his, checking the joint Ezra had already reset back at the canyon. That takes more nerve than most grown men have. I didn't feel very brave, she admitted. Mostly just scared. Brave doesn't mean not scared, Gideon said. Means doing what needs doing anyway. Outside, the storm continued to rage, washing away the last of the smoke, extinguishing whatever remained of the fire that had nearly destroyed everything they'd built. Inside the cave, the four of them settled in for what remained of the night, exhaustion finally catching up with all of them at once. Clementine drifted in and out of sleep, aware each time she woke of at least one of the three men keeping watch nearby, never quite letting her out of reach. Somewhere near dawn, she woke fully to find Gideon sitting close beside her, watching the cave entrance with the same restless vigilance he always carried, though something in his posture had eased since the worst of the danger passed. You should sleep, she murmured. Can't, not yet. Why not? He was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because I keep thinking about how close I came to losing you tonight, and I don't know what to do with that. She reached for his hand, finding it in the dim firelight, lacing her fingers through his. You didn't lose me. Not for lack of Thaddeus trying. His grip tightened around hers, careful of her still healing thumb. I've spent most of my life keeping people at arm's length. Clementine figured it was safer that way. Safer for them. Mostly, he looked down at their joined hands. Tonight scared me in a way bounty hunting never did. Because you care. Because I care more than I know what to do with. She didn't have an answer for that. Not one that felt adequate to the moment. So she simply held his hand a little tighter and let the silence between them say what words couldn't quite manage. Outside, the storm slowly began to ease, the worst of the rain giving way to a softer, steadier fall that promised the drought, at least for now, had finally broken by the time full morning light filtered into the cave. Clementine's feet had stopped throbbing quite so fiercely, though Ezra warned her she wouldn't be walking any real distance for days yet. The rain outside had settled into a gentle, steady rhythm, the kind that soaked deep into ground that had gone too long without it. She sat propped against the cave wall, wrapped in Gideon's duster, watching the three men move through their morning routine with an ease that spoke of years spent surviving together, tending the fire, checking the horses, rationing what little food they'd managed to grab before the fire forced them to run. It was Ezra who noticed first that something had shifted in her, some weight settling behind her eyes that hadn't been there the night before, even accounting for exhaustion and pain. Talk to me, he said quietly, settling beside her while Gideon and Roan worked further off. What's going on in that head of yours? She was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain fall steady outside the cave entrance. I keep thinking about what those men said back at the mine. Held her till the fire clears the property, like I was just another piece of the plan. Another thing to be moved around and disposed of. You're not a thing. I know that. Here she touched her chest. But some part of me still hears it, still remembers being told, back east, that girls like me were born to be used up and thrown away when we stopped being useful. Her voice caught, rough with emotion she'd been holding back since the moment she woke in that mine shaft. I still carry that title, Virgin Mail Order Bride, like it's the only thing that defines what I'm worth. Gideon had gone still nearby, listening, despite pretending to check the horse's tack. Roan had stopped as well, his attention fully on her now. I don't know how to be a wife, she admitted, tears finally spilling free. Not from fear this time, but from something deeper, more complicated, a longing she'd kept buried since arriving on that suffocating platform weeks ago. I don't know how to receive any of you. Not really. Every time I try to imagine it, I hear that factory foreman's voice telling me what I'm for. Roan crossed the cave first, kneeling before her, his expression gentler than she'd ever seen it. He took her bandaged foot carefully in his hands and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to it, right over the worst of the healing wounds. That foreman doesn't get a voice here, he said. Not anymore. Ezra reached out next, brushing a strand of damp hair back from her face, his touch light, grounding. He pressed a soft kiss to her temple, lingering there a moment. You're not being used. Clementine, not by us, never by us. Gideon knelt last, tilting her chin up gently until her eyes met his, steady and unflinching despite the storm still raging outside. Lie down, he said quietly, his thumb brushing across her lower lip, his voice dropping rough and low. We'll show you how to make your own power. You serve no one here. You rule us. Something in her finally broke loose. Some final wall she'd carried since that first terrified step off the train. And she let it go. Let herself lean into 3 sets of careful, worshipful hands that asked nothing of her except her own willing presence. There was no rush in it, no demand, only patience. Only 3 men determined to prove, in whatever way she needed proving, that her worth had never depended on what she could be used for. The storm outside continued through the night, thunder rolling low over the mountains, rain washing the last of the smoke and ash from a land that had nearly burned to nothing. Inside the cave, something quieter and far more permanent took root, a trust built slow and careful, offered without condition, accepted the same way. By morning, the rain had finally stopped. Clementine woke, wrapped warm between the three of them. The cave lit soft with early light. The world outside washed clean and green, in a way it hadn't been in weeks. Whatever Thaddeus still had planned, whatever fight remained ahead of them, she faced it now, carrying something she hadn't had before. Not fear, not the weight of a title she'd never asked for, just the quiet, steady certainty of her own worth, proven not through anything she'd been given, but through everything she'd chosen for herself. Dawn broke gray and smoky over what remained of the ranch. Clementine rode in behind the three men, propped carefully in Gideon's saddle, since her feet still couldn't bear weight, and watched the wreckage come into view through the thinning haze. The barn had survived, mostly, though the roof had scorched black along one edge. The pasture fence was gone in three places. The tree line that used to mark the property's northern edge had burned down to blackened trunks, smoke still curling faintly off a few of them, despite the storm. The house itself still stood. That much, at least, the rain had saved. Roan swore under his breath at the sight of the cattle scattered wide across the valley. Some of them wandered clean off the property in the chaos. Ezra's jaw tightened at the sight of the schoolhouse stall, the door hanging off one hinge, benches overturned inside. Gideon said nothing at all. He just sat there on his horse, taking it in, the same stillness Clementine had noticed in him back at the train station weeks ago. The kind that came right before he made a decision. He thinks he's already won, Gideon finally said. He might have, Roan muttered. Land's not ours anymore. Court order already went through. It's not his either, Clementine said. Not yet. All three men turned to look at her. She reached into the front of her dress, fingers closing around a folded paper she'd kept tucked there since the fire. A paper singed along one edge, but still readable. The ink only slightly smeared from smoke and rain. What is that? Ezra asked. A Homestead Act application. She held it up, careful not to tear the fragile paper further. I filed it 3 days ago, before the fire, before any of this. Gideon stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. You filed for a land claim. I read every one of your books. Ezra, every night, up in that attic, while the rest of you slept. She looked between the three of them, exhaustion and something fiercer than exhaustion burning in her eyes. Territorial law strips felons of property rights. Strips unlicensed practitioners, too. Strips half-blood claims, same as it stripped your original deed. But there's a loophole nobody bothered closing, because nobody expected a woman to use it. What loophole? Roan asked. A single female head of household can file a claim under the Homestead Act, federal law, not territorial. Thaddeus can twist territorial rulings however he wants. But he can't touch a federal claim without going through federal courts. And that takes time he doesn't have before word gets out about what he's been doing up here. Ezra's expression shifted slowly from confusion to something like disbelief. You're saying you own this land. I'm saying I filed to own this land as a single woman because Gideon tore up that marriage contract on the train platform the day I arrived. She looked at him now, steady despite the ache in her chest. You made me legally unattached the moment you did that. I didn't understand what that meant until I started reading, but I understood it well enough to use it. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, pride and disbelief, and something rawer underneath both. You've been planning this since the day Rome got hurt protecting those children. Since the day I realized Thaddeus wasn't going to stop coming after us. She folded the paper carefully back and tucked it against her chest. I couldn't fight him with a gun. I'm not built for that kind of fight. But I could fight him with the same laws he's been twisting to hurt us. Beat him at his own game. Roan let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. You hid a land claim in your dress while running through fire and getting kidnapped. I wasn't about to let it burn. You're something else, Ezra said quietly, and there was real admiration in it, not just surprise. Gideon dismounted first, then reached up to help Clementine down carefully, mindful of her bandaged feet, setting her gently on a fallen log near what remained of the porch. It's not filed with the county yet. No, it needs to go through the federal land office in town. Today, if we can manage it. before Thaddeus finds a way to interfere. Then we go today, Gideon said. All of us. My feet. I'll carry you if I have to. His voice left no room for argument. You've been carrying the rest of us since the day you got here, whether you realized it or not. Least I can do is carry you into town. Ezra helped her onto a horse instead, arranging her carefully so her bandaged feet wouldn't drag against the stirrups. And the four of them set off toward town while the morning sun burned the last of the smoke haze away overhead. The federal land office sat at the edge of town, a squat building that looked far less important than the document it was about to process. The clerk inside, a nervous young man who clearly recognized trouble when three armed mountain men and an injured woman walked through his door, took one look at the paperwork and went pale. This claim's already registered, he said, flipping through a ledger with shaking hands. Filed 3 days back. Confirmed and stamped this morning, actually. First thing, he looked up at Clementine like he couldn't quite believe what he was reading. The whole property, all 640 acres. It's yours, ma'am, legally, federally. Yours and Judge Thaddeus's ruling. Territorial court can't override a confirmed federal homestead claim, not without going through appeals in the territorial capital. And that'll take months, maybe longer. The clerk swallowed hard, begging your pardon. But the judge isn't going to like hearing that. No, Gideon said, a grim satisfaction settling over his face for the first time in days. I imagine he won't. Word traveled fast in a town that small, and by the time they stepped back out onto the street, a crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by whispered rumors of what had happened at the land office. Judge Thaddeus arrived within the hour, flanked by a dozen armed men, his face flushed with a fury that hadn't cooled since sometime before he'd even heard the details straight. You think a piece of paper changes anything, he shouted, stopping his horse in the middle of the street, close enough that Clementine could see the vein pulsing at his temple. That land belongs to the county. My ruling stands. Your ruling, Clementine said, stepping forward despite Gideon's hand reaching instinctively toward her arm, doesn't mean a thing against federal law. Judge? You should have paid better attention to the books you claim to know so well. The crowd along the street had grown thick now, shopkeepers and townsfolk drawn out by the commotion, watching the confrontation unfold with a mix of fear and fascination. Somewhere in the crowd, Clementine spotted a few of the parents whose children had attended her schoolhouse lessons, watching with an intensity that told her they understood exactly what was at stake. Arrest her, Thaddeus barked at his men. Obstruction, fraud, I don't care what charge you use. Gideon, Ezra, and Roan moved as one, stepping forward to shield Clementine. Revolvers, drawn in a single fluid motion that filled the street with the sharp metallic click of hammers pulling back. The armed men flanking Thaddeus hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, clearly not eager to open fire in the middle of a crowded street against three men with reputations like the one standing before them. Clementine pushed forward anyway, stepping past all three men despite their attempts to keep her behind them. No, she said, voice ringing clear across the suddenly silent street. This ends now, and it ends with everyone watching. She held the federally stamped deed high above her head, the paper catching the midday sun, singed edges and all. You want to shoot me? Judge, go ahead. Her voice carried steady despite the fear hammering underneath it. Kill a lawful, federal female landowner in front of the whole town. Let's see how your crooked little court explains that one when the federal marshals come asking questions. Because they will come asking. Judge, I made certain of that. Thaddeus's face went from red to a dangerous, mottled white. What are you talking about? Every piece of evidence against you. The illegal seizure, the arson, the assault on Roan, the kidnapping. She let the words land, watching them ripple through the crowd around them. Murmurs breaking out among the townsfolk who'd gathered close enough to hear. I mailed it all to the federal marshal's office in the territorial capital 2 weeks ago, before any of this happened. Insurance, in case things went exactly the way they've gone. For a long, terrible moment, nobody moved. Thaddeus's men shifted uneasily, glancing between their employer and the growing crowd of witnesses, clearly recalculating whatever loyalty they'd been paid to maintain. Then, from the far end of the street, came the unmistakable sound of horses approaching at a hard gallop. Federal marshals, 6 of them, badges gleaming in the midday sun, rode into town with the kind of authority that made Thaddeus's hired men lower their weapons without needing to be told twice. The lead marshal, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, dismounted directly in front of Thaddeus's horse. "Judge Thaddeus Cole," he said, pulling a folded warrant from inside his coat. "You're under arrest for arson, extortion, assault, and kidnapping, on evidence provided by one Clementine." He glanced at his paperwork. Clementine Ashford, filed 2 weeks prior with this office. Thaddeus's composure finally cracked entirely, his face twisting with disbelief and rage as 2 of the marshals pulled him down off his horse, clamping iron cuffs around his wrists despite his furious protests. "You can't do this," he shouted. "I am the law in this territory." "Not anymore," the marshal said flatly. "Federal law's got a way of trumping territorial corruption once somebody bothers filing the paperwork proper." He glanced toward Clementine with something like respect. "Ma'am, we'll need your statement, but from what you sent us. You've done half our investigation for us already." The crowd had gone from tense silence to a low, spreading murmur of astonishment. And somewhere in the back, someone actually started clapping, the sound spreading slowly through the gathered townsfolk until it swelled into something like celebration. Clementine lowered the deed, her hand trembling now that the danger had finally passed, and felt Gideon's arm come around her shoulders. "Steady and solid. You mailed evidence to federal marshals 2 weeks ago," he said, disbelief and pride warring in his voice, "while teaching 6 children their letters, while reading law books every night, while running a ranch." "I told you," she said, leaning into him despite her exhaustion. "I get to decide what's safest for me now. Turns out I decided on making sure justice actually happened, instead of just hoping it might." Roan let out a low whistle, shaking his head as the marshals led Thaddeus away in chains, his shouted protests fading as they marched him toward the jailhouse at the far end of town. "Remind me never to underestimate you again." "You already learned that lesson," Ezra said, a faint smile finally breaking through his exhaustion. Back at the mine shaft, summer gave way to autumn slowly, the way it always did up in the mountains. The pines shedding their driest needles, the grass returning green and thick to pastures that had nearly burned away entirely. Judge Thaddeus sat awaiting federal trial in a territorial prison 200 miles east, his corruption exposed thoroughly enough that even his old allies in town had scattered rather than risk association with his name. The new well came in deep and clean, finished just as the last of the harvest wheat came ready for cutting. Clementine stood at its edge one late afternoon, watching the bucket rise full and clear, a far cry from the dry, rationed trickle that had marked her first weeks on the mountain. She held the deed in her hand again, the official copy now, replacing the singed original that Ezra had carefully preserved and framed for the wall. 640 acres, legally and federally hers, the single most powerful piece of paper any of them had ever held. She'd spent the morning at the kitchen table, drafting a legal addendum with the same careful attention she'd once used to study Ezra's old law books, dividing the property into an equal 4-way trust, each of their names entered with the same legal weight as her own. "You didn't have to do this," Gideon said, watching her sign the final line, his voice quiet with something that sounded almost like disbelief. "I know I didn't have to." She set the pen down, meeting his eyes steady. "I chose to. There's a difference, and it's a difference that matters more than you might think. The land's yours, federally, legally, entirely yours. You could have kept it that way. What would that make me? Then no different than Thaddeus, holding power over people, because the law happened to favor me and not them." She shook her head. "A real partnership doesn't work that way. Not the kind I want to build here." Ezra, reading over the addendum a second time, looked up with something warm in his expression. "Equal shares, all 4 names. Equal shares," she confirmed. because that's what a family is supposed to be. Nobody above anybody else. Nobody kneeling to anybody else. Outside, the golden light of late afternoon stretched long across the valley, catching the dust kicked up by children playing tag near the rebuilt schoolhouse. Its roof fresh and unburned. Its walls sturdy enough to withstand whatever winter brought next. The number of students had doubled since the fire. Word having spread through the valley about the teacher who'd stood her ground against a corrupt judge and won. Gideon came up behind Clementine as she watched the children play, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin lightly against her shoulder. Ezra and Roan finished their work near the barn and made their way up the path toward the house, catching sight of the two of them framed against the golden evening light. A real family doesn't need bloodlines or bills of sale to prove it exists, Gideon said softly, his voice carrying just for her. Took me 35 years and nearly losing everything to understand that properly. What made you understand it? You did. He turned her gently to face him. Watching you fight for those children. Watching you fight for us. Even when the law and every corrupt man in this territory said you shouldn't have the right to. Nobody ever has to kneel here. Clementine, not to me, not to Thaddeus, not to anybody. A family is a place where every human being has the right to stand tall. Ezra and Roan reached them just as the sun dipped lower, painting the whole valley in deep gold and amber. Roan carried a small burlap sack, setting it down on the porch step with a satisfied grunt. First proper harvest since the drought broke, he said. Wheat's good this year. Real good. Enough to see us through winter, Ezra added, and enough left over to help a few families in the valley who lost crops to the same drought. Clementine smiled at that, unsurprised. It was exactly the kind of thing this found family had built together. Not just a ranch, not just a home, but something that reached outward too. Something that remembered what it felt like to be the one left out, left behind, left without a voice, and worked every day to make sure fewer people had to feel that way. She thought back to the terrified young woman who'd stepped off that train months ago, sweating in the summer heat, certain she'd been sold into a nightmare. That woman hadn't understood yet what freedom actually meant, hadn't understood that it wasn't the absence of hardship, but the presence of choice, real choice, the kind nobody could strip away with a corrupt ruling or a torn contract or a title forced onto her before she'd ever had a say. She'd found that freedom here, on a mountain that had nearly burned to nothing, built by 3 men who'd never once tried to own her, only to stand beside her. Virgin mail order bride, she murmured, testing the old title against everything she'd become since first hearing it. Feels like a lifetime ago. Feels like somebody else's story. Roan agreed. It was somebody else's story, Clementine said, watching the children below finally break from their game as the dinner bell rang from the schoolhouse porch, calling them home to families who'd fought just as hard as she had for the right to raise them free. Mine starts here, free, educated, and choosing every single day who I want to stand beside. Gideon's arm tightened gently around her shoulders as the last light faded gold behind the mountains. Ezra and Roan settling in close on either side. The 4 of them watching the valley settle into evening together. A family built not on bloodlines or contracts, but on choice, freely given and freely returned. Exactly the way it was always meant to be. When Clementine first stepped off that train, she believed her future had already been decided by a contract signed in desperation. She thought her worth depended on what others expected from her, what they were willing to pay for her, or how they intended to use her. Like so many people who have been hurt, she believed survival meant accepting whatever life handed her. But this story reminds us that the strongest chains are often the ones we cannot see, the lies that tell us we are too broken, too ordinary, or too powerless to change our own destiny. What makes Clementine extraordinary isn't that she carried a gun faster than anyone else, or that she won every battle with brute force. Her greatest weapon was her refusal to surrender her humanity. She chose compassion when bitterness would have been easier. She chose education when ignorance kept others in power. She chose courage even when she was terrified. Every page she read by candlelight, every child she taught to read, every time she stood between injustice and the innocent, she quietly changed the future long before anyone realized it. The three mountain men learned an equally powerful lesson. Gideon, Ezra, and Roan spent years believing that protecting someone meant making decisions for them. But real love isn't about possession. It isn't about control. It isn't about saving someone by taking away their freedom. Real love gives another person the space to choose, even when that choice is frightening. The moment Gideon tore apart that marriage contract, he unknowingly planted the first seed of the family they would eventually become. Not because he claimed Clementine, but because he gave her back her right to decide her own life. Perhaps that's the greatest message this story offers us. A family isn't created by blood, by law, or by a piece of paper. It's built through trust, respect, sacrifice, and the daily decision to stand beside one another through hardship. The strongest homes are not those without storms, but those where everyone faces the storm together. This story also reminds us that knowledge can be more powerful than violence. While evil men relied on fear, corruption, and guns, Clementine quietly armed herself with books. She proved that education can defeat oppression, that wisdom can expose corruption, and that one determined person with the courage to learn can change the fate of an entire community. Sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not on a battlefield, but with someone turning the next page of a book. No matter where you are in life today, perhaps there's a little of Clementine in all of us. Maybe you've been underestimated. Maybe someone has tried to define your value, your future, or your limits. If that's true, remember this. Your past may explain who you were, but it never has the final say about who you can become. Every new choice is another chance to write a different ending. Thank you so much for spending this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or reminded you that kindness and courage still matter, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need this reminder today. We'd love to hear your thoughts as well. What lessons stayed with you the most? And which character inspired you the most? Leave your answer in the comments below. Until our next story, take care of yourself. Keep believing in the power of compassion. Never stop learning, and never let anyone else decide your worth. We'll see you again very soon around another campfire with another unforgettable tale from the American frontier. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.